Welcome to a special interview series commemorating 40 years of Lambda Scholarship Foundation Canada. In honor of this milestone, we're diving into the rich and complex history of an organization that has played a pivotal role in supporting the evolving needs of 2S LGBTQIA+ communities in Canada. Through candid conversations with some of the key individuals who helped shape the organization, this project aims to preserve and present the stories that define Lambda's legacy. These interviews offer space for reflection, celebration, and insight, offering a vivid portrait of the Foundation's evolution and its ongoing commitment to advancing equity in academic research, financial support, and education. For this interview, I sat down with John Barton. John was associated with Lambda Scholarship Foundation Canada from 1991 to 2007, primarily through Wilde About Sappho, the organization's signature queer literary fundraiser. A Canadian poet, editor, and essayist known for his deeply personal and formally inventive work exploring identity, sexuality, history, and art. John was featured as a reader 3 times in Wilde About Sappho, including in its inaugural and final editions in 1991 and 2007, respectively. Although he did not serve on the board or hold a staff position, he played a key role coining the event's name and helping it shape its identity, affirming his connection to one of Lambda's most visible and influential initiatives, and helping to elevate its national profile. So hello, John. Thanks for speaking with us today. Can you tell us, how did you first hear about Lambda Scholarship Foundation Canada?
I would have heard of it through my friend Philip Robert, who was part of Lambda board of, I guess, the beginnings of the foundation. And I had, of course, heard of the Lambda chapter that was in Ottawa, where, professional gays and lesbian got together, once a month for drinks. And I never was part of that, but Philip was very active in it. So that would be where I first heard about Lambda. Philip, of course, founded Wilde About Sappho, and I probably became more aware of the foundation. In the original years, it wasn't to establish scholarships at universities, it was to give out awards to accomplished members of the LGBTQ community in a number of disciplines. I think human rights, which I think they actually did give an award, arts and literature, and I think there were 4 groups. And so that was what I understood the foundation to be, seeing as its reason to be.
So, it was always very much interested in rewarding excellence, be it literature, be it, as you mentioned, human rights, be it also academic work. You mentioned Wilde About Sappho. From what I understand, it began in 1991, and it was a fundraiser, literary fundraiser for the event. The event featured several Canadian and also in time international LGBTQ writers reading from the work, including yourself. Can you speak a little bit about how you might remember the idea of creating a literary fundraiser for the organization came about? What was Lambda hoping to achieve at that time?
I suppose, as I understood it, it was to raise money. Philip Robert, who ran Wilde About Sappho in the initial years, was and is one of my closest friends. We met, maybe 5 years before, and I was starting to publish books of my own. And I talked about often, wouldn't it be nice if there was a gay and lesbian reading series in Ottawa? And, it was more a hypothetical, a what if idea. And I came up with the name Wilde About Sappho to bring the 2 letters in our alphabet mix together. Because, of course, back in the late 80s, early 90s, we just talked about gays and lesbians and maybe bisexual people. So, Wilde and About Sappho brought the 2 together, turned Oscar Wilde's name into an adjective and kind of gave it kind of this sense of, enthusiasm, I suppose, in the name, about LGBTQ writers, with 2 of the iconic names brought into the mix. And so I never really went anywhere with that idea of having a series, somewhat similar to what you do with the Violet Hour. And so Philip asked if he could use the name or borrow it. And I thought, why not? And it turned into be a really good kind of tag. You immediately knew it was queer. If you thought about it at all, you realized it was about literature. And if you thought about the names, it was about, legacy, about we have a tradition we're building upon. Let's celebrate it. It's bigger than our own time. And so I think that's why the name has so much meaning to it. And it also kind of represents bringing people together, bringing, you know, gay men and lesbians together, two discrete groups of people who may feel a little bit of discomfort even around. So, you know, the first Wilde About Sappho happened in November of 1991, and it was me and Gabriella Gallagher. It was Candice Graham. You would start with people nearby, a cost to bring them in, they bring people themselves. And it also kind of says literature is here, it's among us. People are doing it, queer people are doing it. You should know about them. Let's celebrate not necessarily them, but the pursuit of writing. And Philip and I had belonged to we volunteered for the PTS library committee. PTS was this social services NGO to support the queer community. In fact, we learned about the library committee and the library because we both belonged to the gay men's discussion group at that time. And so we decided to raise money for the library by having a reading that was held at I believe at University of Ottawa, if I remember correctly, with Jane Rule and Edward O. Phillips, who I think Jane was touring one of her last novel, Memory Board, and Edward O. Phillips had probably just published his first mystery, Buried on Sunday, I think it was called. And so it was a huge success. We packed the room. And so I think probably that really inspired Philip, gave him the confidence to do this because we knew that there was an audience, and it was such a success and so much fun to do.
Yeah, I'd like to maybe hear a little bit about what was happening at that time when it came to LGBTQ literature in Ottawa. I think you were saying like how great would it be to have a reading series. It sounded like maybe there wasn't a lot happening at the time. Can you talk a little bit about because Lambda and Wilde About Sappho ended up developing a lot of local writers, right, and bringing them to new audiences. But can you tell us a little bit about what was happening when it came to LGBTQ literature in Canada at that time?
Why? I like to think of it as a kind of, it was finding its feet. I had just published, I'd published my first openly queer book in 1984, so it was several years before, but it was published by actually a small press based here in Victoria called Ecstasis Editions, and it was actually their second title. Some people would think it was a chapbook, but it was a one long poem called Hidden Structure. The year before Wilde About Sappho, I published a book called Great Men with Quarry Press in Kingston. And I would say that kind of was a much more visible book. And so I would say queer writing was becoming visible in Canada in a more concentrated way. There were multiple voices, but I still felt kind of on my own. And maybe that's the function of living in a smaller city, not being in Toronto. I wasn't, sort of meeting Sky Gilbert for drinks, if he was even in Toronto by then. I'm sure he was. The way the book was described on the cover copy, I always remember the first phrase, courageous and outrageous, which I think kind of sums up maybe how mainstream writing might have seen queer writing as A, courageous, and B, outrageous, and being, unapologetic, deviant, different, unabashedly in your face. I always felt that the least bit of skin you showed in a queer poem at that time would be considered incredibly shocking in a way that straight skin would not be. It's funny, around the same time, I've actually never really talked about this in any public way. Around the same time, maybe a year later, I participated in a fundraiser for the League of Canadian Poets, also held at the National Library, and it was themed on erotica. And so I read my polite, queer poems, but afterwards I was chastised by some of the fellow readers. I won't go into too much description because I don't really want to, out anyone. But, I was chastised for reading my poem in front of her, well, one reader, her family, her aunt, but she was quite happy to read a poem that started fucking in the afternoon in front of her aunt. And another person complained that I had read my poems in front of a child, as if I was responsible for that child being there and I should change. So, in a way that more than anything maybe characterizes sort of the predicament a queer writer would find themselves in at that time. And so, and when you think about it and contrast that to Wilde About Sappho, where you would be reading among people that understood and valued and didn't question. In fact, they would feel affirmed by all of those explicit references, however discreet they may have actually been. And, it's funny, it's bringing back a lot, just thinking about the contrast. I hadn't thought about that quite that way before. And that was that experience the year later was one of the foundational experiences of my professional life that I think it showed me the terrain that I was moving into. And I always felt at the time that they may question my content, sending my work to publishers and magazines, but they will never be able to fault me on my style. They will never fault me on a manner. I will dare them to find fault with my skills, that they only can deny me because of my content if it makes them feel discomfort.
It's wonderful that Wild About Sappho has almost mimicked also your career as a writer too,
yes.
You could kind of say, over the course of like 15 or 16. That was like your introduction to it in a way. You said that was kind of at the beginning, I believe, of what you were
as a queer writer. I mean, I published my first book a decade before that. And, I also published what at that time would have been called a documentary poem about Emily Carr. So, but yeah, it was kind of a public coming out. And Wilde About Sappho does kind of bracket a period. I always call it, I lived in Ottawa during my prime, but I didn't notice at the time, my late 20s to my early 40s. And I also established, I think, my career on my reputation in those years. And I read for Wilde About Sappho 3 times, 91, 98, when I had a new book of poems. I read with Sarah Schulman and Shyam Salvadori. And even just that transition that from, a gala with 4 local writers to, an international writer, Sarah Schulman, and a very prominent Canadian novelist. It was Shyam Salvadori, who just published his 2nd book. And then I read in one final time the last year, 2007, and it was all built around an anthology that I co-edited with Billy Nickerson, seminal Canada's gay male poets. And it was the first and remains the only truly historical anthology of gay male writing in Canada that goes back to, the late 1800s, starting with actually with Émile Nelligan and Frank Oliver Call, 2 Montreal associated writers, all the way up to a guy named Sean Horler, who was just publishing his first book of poems. In fact, I edited it, and so it was coming out that year, I think, maybe the year before. So, and just going back to, my book, Great Men, that came out in 1990, one of the things I noticed about the anthology is that we had as many pages after 1990 when that book was published. So from 1990 to 2007, 17 years, as we had for the previous 90 years. And so it really showed me that was kind of a fulcrum year. I won't say that I was the fulcrum, but someone else can say that for me. So yeah, so there's been tremendous growth. And then after, even more growth.
So you mentioned some of the writers that have appeared there, Sarah Schulman, Shyam Salvadori. You said the first year was a lot of local writers, getting the ones that are closest as well. But I'm kind of curious, like over the 16 or 17 years, do you know much about like year to year how the writers were selected? And like maybe also what was your role in the production of these events?
If I had any role, it was mostly advisory. Philip would bounce ideas off me, and I'm trying to think. I think he was still doing it when I read the second time in 98. Sometime after that, Gary Sealey took over. So I'm sure that, I mean, I don't remember recommending people necessarily. But another thing I've just thought of, so, the local LGBTQ bookstore after Stonewall, Philip and I also belonged to a gay men's reading group that David Rimmer, the owner, ran out of that store. And it started around 92, and it was still going after I left in 2000, at the end of 2003. Some of the writers that we encountered in that book club actually were some of the people we invited. I just remembered that just now. And so people like Paul Russell, who came up from the United States, who wrote some wonderful novels, I think. And I think he read in around 2000, 2001. I remember a conversation I had with him about the state of publishing, LGBT publishing. And he was talking about how all the big American presses were kind of realizing that the gay writers that they had brought into their stables were not kind of yielding the big bucks and big sales that they hoped they would. And so many of them were being kind of let go. And that was an interesting thing. And I think Paul, to some extent, experienced that too. And you can see it in his later books. They're published by smaller presses. Another writer who he knew that he mentioned this happened to was Scott Heim, who wrote Mysterious Skin. He was let go by a big New York publisher at that time. It was also a time when publishers were giving big advances to writers, regardless of whether they were straight or gay, and were realizing they weren't making back the advances. And so there was a lot of debt, I think it was a larger thing that was going on, but LGBTQ writers were being singled out or felt singled out. And I think that's changed again. I think the big American publishers are publishing queer writers in greater number than they have, 10 years ago. I always felt that, the university presses in the United States really stepped up in the way that they haven't in this country. I'm thinking of Wisconsin, and I think it's Massachusetts university presses. They have LGBTQ lines, whereas, where is that happening anywhere in Canadian publishing except for, the flag carrier Arsenal Pulp, Yeah.
I think what you're saying is also making me think a little bit about the interest of the mainstream readers maybe also discovering LGBTQ work. But it seems like Wilde About Sappho really was able to address that in a significant way, because from what I understand, sometimes there would be like 400 people at these events.
Yes, that's right.
That would be reading, and that it was also promoted among like the more general population with like a desire to kind of bring people out, to kind of create bridges between maybe the LGBTQ community and the straight community.
Yeah,
What do you attribute that success to, I guess, like in terms of in terms of bringing out this number of people to kind of, savor, enjoy, learn about LGBTQ literature?
I suspect, I mean, there was no social media. I suspect word of mouth is really important. Maybe a larger Lambda group, they sold tickets. I think there was a lot of people being given packages of tickets to sell to their friends. And the line, "This is a good cause," was probably used a lot. I think there was a lot of support from Capital Extra was really significant. The bookstore was really important. And the National Library was very supportive. So it would have been in their own publicity, in their newsletter and things like that, I suspect. And, the other thing I'm just thinking about, there was just greater support for writing in general in, the big national papers, like the Ottawa Citizen had a local, like a Saturday book column about the local writing scene. So I wouldn't be surprised if Bert Hewart, who wrote that column, didn't mention it as well. And we would bring our friends. I remember bringing a friend of mine who was straight, and she commented afterwards, it was a new experience to feel like she was in a minority. She was surrounded by all these gay people, and it gave her, it kind of affected her in a new way. She felt changed or different a little bit. Trying to think of the right word, surrounded, and seeing, functioning, supportive, healthy environment for queer writing gave her an insight into something that she knew nothing about. maybe
Mm.
had ideas about that were maybe not even fully conscious. And so I'm sure there were a lot of experiences like that for people.
What was the atmosphere like at those readings? Like, if you can kind of, for those of us who weren't able to be there, I know that the library is a very impressive building. Like, what was the buzz like?
Well, I mean, the location was really important in the sense that here's this national institution welcoming us into its hallowed halls, and the events manager, for lack of a better word, Randall Ware, he was a big book person. They had a very healthy reading series at the National Library at one time. I went all the time, and I knew Randall really very well, and he told me that after the gala for the Governor General's Awards, the Wilde About Sappho is the largest event that they hosted, literary wise, in the library every year. So, it probably was meaningful to the library itself. So the environment was stately, beautiful, and here we are in this lovely, comfortable, large auditorium. It's not like sort of doing a reading uh, in a coffee shop while they're making cappuccinos and the machine interrupting the flow of the reading. I once gave a reading
I've
where,
been to my fair share of those.
oh, yeah, well, my favorite one is I gave a reading at a gay and lesbian bookstore in Seattle in probably maybe 1990 for great men. And I had to stop because a garbage truck was backing up to the window because the dumpster was, just beside it. And so we all watched this garbage truck. Anyway, so none of that happened. National Library, excellent acoustics, and people were, everyone was there to enjoy and be socializing amongst themselves in a supportive environment and receptive to what they were hearing. Maybe there were a lot of people there that weren't, committed readers. They were there because of its cachet. And so, they got to be exposed to another side of queer life. They weren't there to pick people up necessarily.
So I have a list here of like some guest readers over the years. Kind of reads of a bit of a who's who also of kind of queer can lit. We have Emma Donahue, Camilla Gibb, Cheyenne Salvador, as you said, Wason Choi, Shani Mutu, the late R.M. Vaughan, Helen Humphreys, Diane Brand, Jean-Paul Daoust, also like people like Felice Bacano and Sarah Schulman from the States. I don't know, like, are there any kind of particular readings or moments that stand out in your memory, kind of like people that you got to meet?
Well, one that really stands out is Leslie Feinberg, who wrote Stone Butch Blues, a seminal trans a novel slash memoir that they came up from the States when they were publishing a big kind of historical book about trans people through history. I was blown away by Stone Butch Blues, which I also read in this book club that David Rimmer ran out of his bookstore, and was really moved to see this person who I admired so much and admired the story of perseverance and triumph that is articulated in Stone Butch Blues. So that really was meaningful to me. And another reader would be Daphne Marlett, a writer based in Vancouver. Uh, I think it was when she published her novel Taken with Anansi that year. So she came, and I'd seen her read when I was a student at the University of Victoria, God, in the late 70s. And I always think of Daphne as kind of a canonical Canadian writer. And so here we had this figure so important to experimental writing in Canada, sort of the other school that kind of emerged on the West Coast with Bowring and Blazer, those people. So having her come and remind us that queer writing was canonical in Canadian letters in a way that I don't think people necessarily thought. I mean, what was always the sneer? It's not universal enough. It's a word I despise. I don't believe in the universal at all. I believe in the specific and particularized. But yeah, and queer books would be praised. Oh, it's broken through. So again, none of that's necessary when you come to Wilde About Sappho because you've drunk the Kool-Aid already. You know of what they speak, and it's great to have those images, those experiences reflected back. And that's what Wild About Sappho did. I think that's the ultimate thing that queer writing does and what Wilde About Sappho does is it affirms. I always think that you read for two reasons. You read to see yourself and to learn something new. And so in both instances, or both criterion were criteria.
It sounds to me also too, it was like, it might have been the first stage for a lot of people too, and giving them the kind of the encouragement to continue on with their work, and even just, you mentioned like the anthology, the last year that you were involved in 2007 Seminole. I know that there was tours too, right? And I think there was this chance to bring Wild About Sappho to other cities, namely, I think Montreal, Ottawa, Vancouver, Guelph, and Toronto. I know that there were, writers were always also invited to take part in writers' roundtables and meet with students in the Ottawa area. So I think it did a lot for the careers of some of these writers.
Yeah, and all those sort of the tour, the the multi-city thing, and the roundtables, and the writers in the schools. That would have been the brainchild of Gary Sealey, and probably got them into Canterbury High School, which is the arts high school in Ottawa, which is actually, coincidentally, I think that's where Ben Ladouceur went to school. And so he may well have been in those classes. I know that Ben also volunteered in the last years of Wilde About Sappho as well, in some way, probably after I had left. But yeah, I mean, I think all those things would be really meaningful to writers. I think being brought into the schools is a very brave thing for queer writers to go into schools, because of all of the baggage that people throw at us that is so fallacious. I've always myself been careful about going into schools, so to have it kind of curated would make it even safer.
You mentioned Gary Sealey, one of the founders of Lambda. Did you have much interaction with Gary? I'm also asking people to share their memories of Gary. When you think back, what do you think about when you think about Gary?
That he had the ability to get people to do things without them really realizing that they had agreed. He was very good at getting you to do things for him. And they would be things in service of the goals that he had, regardless. He wasn't using you to, iron his clothes. He was getting you to, I don't know, contact someone on his behalf to invite them to read. I'm just thinking of a hypothetical situation, but he was very, very good at that. And he was very good at creating possibilities and conceiving of these events, and in soliciting your involvement. And, I was less swayed, shall we say, than some, but, people had great experiences doing those things. He was a force. I can't think of the first time I met him. I met him through Philip and Hugh, his partner, and we were kind of part of the same social group for maybe a decade. And I don't know, he's just had that magic touch to get people to do things.
So looking back, over the years, we talked about this a bit, it kind of coincided with your growth as a queer writer. Do you think much about like what impact Wild About Sappho had on your own writing?
I think it helped me feel that I was part of a community of writers that, that was, maybe more national in scope. Certainly, and that there were people out there that were interested in hearing what we had to say collectively and individually, especially for a poet. The idea that there's much of an audience out there to begin with is something one wonders about. I always feel I'm writing for the future. In a sense, someone will find it someday. So I think that for me would be, and also the validation of being asked. I mean, did do it 3 times, and in a way, the last time where we were doing it not just for ourselves, but for this anthology. I think the anthology Seminole also created that sense of belonging. The readings that we had in Montreal and Toronto and Ottawa, there were different readers in each one. Some people who read in more than one, but it reminded us that we're not lonely voices. We're part of I hesitate to use the word, it's too much, it's too sweet a metaphor, but a choir. We have peers. Feeling you have peers is really important. The legacy of things like Wild About Sappho are maybe for the people that came and felt emboldened to write themselves or felt that it was possible. That may be the real thing that inspired. And I know it's being revived. And in November, I'll be in Ottawa for a new edition of Wilde About Sappho. And I think people are aware that it's going to happen and are excited. So the legacy is also kind of hinted at in that excitement that people are delighted to come back and hear new voices, and it will be different. You know, and it will reflect the difference in Canadian writing, where they're more. It's not just going to be a white um, uh, set of readers. It's not going to be white. It's not going to be just even LGBT, gay and male. There will be a trans writer, racialized writers, Black writers. So it kind of reflects where LGBTQ writing is today and the changes in Canadian writing as a whole.
All right. Well, I want to thank you, John, for taking the time to speak with us and share your memories about Wilde About Sappho. It's greatly appreciated.
Well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
We hope that these stories inspire and deepen your understanding. Let's stop there for a second. We hope that these stories inspire and deepen your understanding of Lambda Scholarship Foundation's legacy and enduring impact. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't miss the other interviews we've posted as part of Lambda's 40th anniversary project. There are plenty more inspiring voices and stories to discover. So thank you. Thank you, John.
Thank you.